Putin is trying to shift the narrative, however, it benefits him at different points in time. So, what he defines as a victory is a bit of a shifting target depending on whether he speaks to his domestic audiences or international audiences.
Trump is his ally in this point because Trump is putting diplomatic pressure on Ukraine while he is putting military pressure on Ukraine. So now Ukraine is under double pressure.
Each time we come out in support of Ukraine with more European money on the table, you have a kind of backlash of many voters saying, look, if you are able to put, let's say, 500 billion on the table, how on earth can you tell me you cannot put the same amount for the NHS?
Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly international affairs podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. We're talking about Ukraine this week. How could we not? It is more uncertain than ever. Talks between the US and Russia about a so-called peace plan have failed. Russia saying, indeed, that if Europe wants war, it is ready for it. And meanwhile, the European Union has made not much progress on what to do about frozen Russian assets. Can they be used to help fund Ukraine? Nor is defense cooperation progressing particularly fast either. Well, against that backdrop, I have a great, if somber, panel here to discuss this. Grégoire Roos, who's director of our Europe and Russia and Eurasia programs, Natalie Sabanadze, senior research fellow, former Georgian ambassador to Brussels, and Jaroslava Barbieri, research fellow with our Ukraine forum. Let us plunge straight in. Grégoire, where are we?
Well, it's the £1 billion question. I think we've just had another go at the merry-go-round. Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, traveled to meet with President Putin and his team, including Yuri Ushakov, the foreign policy advisor to the Russian president. It's reported that they sat for 5 hours, and they were meant actually to meet in Brussels today with President Zelensky, and we've heard a few moments ago that the meeting had been called off and that the Americans would be heading back to Washington and the Ukrainian president heading back to Kyiv. So that shows that the Russians saw that the demands, apparently from the Europeans, but I would guess that also the Americans, were not at the level of what the Russians expected, or rather too high. And they said, it's a no.
And you say, interestingly, you assume from the Americans, but we've had a really quite a shifting American position. We had the 28-point plan not so long ago, a matter of weeks ago, hammered out between the US and Russia with, it seemed, enormous Russian influence. Then we had a 19-point plan as the Europeans and Ukrainians got in to have their say. And then this is what Russia has rejected. Do we feel that the US has a consistent view in this, or is it simply trying to get it done?
I think the latter seems to me as the more likely option. If you look at it after the leaks of the transcripts of the phone calls between Steve Witkoff and his Russian counterpart, it was clear that the Americans were working hard to crack a deal. They spent 5 hours in Moscow, and what we could have expected is that anything that the Americans would have deemed too excessive a request from the European, they would have dropped it. Well, apparently they didn't, because I quote the Russian president's foreign policy advisor, while there were some points we could agree on, our president did not hide our critical, even negative stance on a number of proposals. So that means that the Americans just shared the message from the Europeans. So again, it's a twist and turns, and I must say, it is difficult to really understand which side the Americans are.
Natalie, you look at Russia for us, and indeed what Russia, not just Putin, is thinking on this. But should we assume that Putin has no incentive to do a deal at this point, unless it gives him things he hasn't been able to get by fighting?
I think Putin is bluffing at the moment. Unlike many, I think he does want a peace deal, but he wants the peace deal on his terms, the kind of peace that brings him to strategic victory. And I think that if this victory is not imminent, that comes straight after the deal, it will come later. He looks at this as a process, a multi-staged process. And this is not going to be the end of the war, even if the peace deal is signed. Look at what happened with the Cold War. We thought the West had won the war, and I think what is going on right now is Russia basically taking a revenge, undoing the damage, what Putin called catastrophe of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In many respects, this is what's going on. So we have to look at it as a multi-phased process from the perspective of Russians. Now, he's bluffing because he tells Trump that he's gaining territory and he can sustain the war of attrition endlessly. But this is not true. He can probably sustain the war of attrition longer than Ukraine, but not without costs. And the costs will be real. He will need a mobilization, which will be extremely unpopular politically. He will need a sustained economic growth, which is not guaranteed. He will need technological military innovation and adaptation as the war goes on, and that is difficult under sanctions. And that also means greater Chinese support, which means greater Chinese dependency. All of these are costly and politically not necessarily popular. So he's aware of all this. The kind of deal he gets is what he's trying to get is the deal that puts in place conditions that will allow him to upset the costs and eventually get to what I would call strategic victory. And it is the opposite of the strategic defeat that the West, and he thinks particularly Europe, wants to impose on Russia.
That is a really, really good account of what we might think his strategy is, to the extent we can tell that. Do you think that right at the moment he thinks he's winning? Because there have been these claims of taking significant towns, I'm thinking of Pokrovsk, that being a significant point, a salient into the Donbass. He says he's winning on the battlefield.
He says he's winning, but it took him 4 years to get to Pokrovsk. His gains are not very substantial. And in this process, in these 4 years, he has also accrued considerable costs, political costs. His bandwidth has been tested. His influence on Europe is not the same. Energy dependency is not the same. Assad has fallen. His footprint in the Middle East is not the same. In Africa, Wagner was much more effective than Africa Corps. His influence in the so-called near abroad is not the same. These are not irreversible. I think he's aware that this could be reversed, so he needs the kind of victory that will allow him to reverse this. What he's saying is that he's winning is because he wants to sell it to Trump, and Trump is his ally in this point because Trump is putting diplomatic pressure on Ukraine while he is putting military pressure on Ukraine. So now Ukraine is under double pressure. And if Putin was not able to break Ukrainians on the battlefield, perhaps with the help of Trump, he will be, because there is a risk of losing U.S. support.
We will come on to those points in just a second, but Jaroslava, let me put it to you from the Ukrainian point of view. Putin claims to have made a significant capture of a town. From your context there, is that, and this is a matter of dispute between the leaders right now, but from your understanding, what is the truth?
Putin is trying to shift the narrative, however, it benefits him at different points in time. So what he defines as a victory is a bit of a shifting target depending on whether he speaks to his domestic audiences or international audiences. Pokrovsk is an important settlement when it comes to being a hub for logistical railways and roads. However, it's not a strategic settlement that will really fundamentally shift the nature of the current front line. It's important the timing of Putin's declared victory right ahead of this round.
Is it now essentially under Russian control?
So this is still being contested. We have seen video reports from Moscow that have shown Russian soldiers in the center of Pokrovsk, but from a Ukrainian perspective, there are still pockets of the town that have not been occupied yet. So the expectation is that ultimately Pokrovsk will fall to Russian control. However, the capture of the town will not fundamentally shift the current front line.
And just take us a bit into the last couple of weeks in Ukraine, which have been very difficult for President Zelensky because of the corruption allegations around some of his team, and he's lost his right-hand man, Yermak. How much has this affected him diplomatically at this point when the US is trying, it says, to strike a deal?
Yes, of course, this corruption scandal couldn't have come at a worse time for President Zelensky, particularly because of this renewed round of negotiations. At first glance, it would seem that the ousting of Andriy Yermak would leave a political vacuum that would be hard for President Zelensky to fill because of the huge influence that Yermak has concentrated in his hands over the past few years. Particularly, he has acted as a de facto vice president and sometimes even foreign minister, national security advisor. And he, over time, has become this toxic figure, both domestically and internationally, because of this role of a gatekeeper that he has taken for himself. So, because of this toxic reputation that he has acquired, actually his ousting has provided a positive opportunity for Zelensky to really send the message, both internationally and domestically, that loyalty to the country's national interest has won over loyalty to his closest circle. And I think that that is a very clear message that Zelensky wanted to send, and he has managed successfully to do so.
Yes, and Yermak, of course, was not keen on the national anti-corruption body, had wrangled with it back in the summer. And so this is very much President Zelensky saying, look, I respect these investigations into corruption and so on. Grégoire, you and I have just come back from Chatham House's big annual conference in Berlin where we were talking about just these things.
I think for me, the real lesson of the past few weeks, we hear that on stages, we hear that in the press, but we also hear that on the street and on social media. Each time we come out in support of Ukraine with more European money on the table, you have a kind of backlash of many voters saying, look, if you are able to put, let's say, 500 billion on the table, how on earth can you tell me you cannot put the same amount for the NHS? Or for that matter, for pension reform. And so you would go to France and you say, you ask us to work for 2 more years because we do not have the money, but you could put 500 billion on the table for a country that is so far away. I think this is a narrative that is posing a growing risk to political leaders who across Europe are suffering from a significant weakness in parliament. It's true for the German chancellor. It is absolutely true for the French president. It is to some extent true for the British prime minister. And so if we do not address this issue, we will lose popular support, and that will translate in the polls in the next elections. There are solutions, of course.
I completely agree with you, Grégoire. And in a way, it is the big European challenge at the moment. How do you persuade voters to give up some of the welfare, the pensions that they like, and put money into war, into defense, a war that may not seem very close to them? And as you say, many leaders are having battles about this, so to speak, with their voters. Though I was very struck in our Berlin conference how some of the more optimistic views on that, political views, came from countries which had had a big financial crisis. I'm thinking of Greece and Ireland and Portugal, and who'd managed to have these famous tough conversations with their voters. And Germany, of course, in a slightly different position because it does have the ability at this point to spend more money, even if that's controversial with voters. It doesn't have the debt that the UK does for a start. Grégoire, where do you see this going in Europe? Because Ukraine needs the money now.
In the end, it's a question of political leadership and pedagogy. It's interesting that we're having that discussion almost a year after Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta handed their reports to Ursula von der Leyen, because putting money on the table, not just to support Ukraine militarily, but to invest in our defense, innovation, technology, and infrastructure is an opportunity to boost prosperity and industrial competitiveness, to support the developments of new jobs. Now, we have seen that the European Commission has launched a new initiative to help 600,000 European workers upskill and transfer from one industry, mostly the automotive industry and other hard-to-abate sectors, to the defense industry, amongst others. That is a historic opportunity. If you do not translate this support to Ukraine question into meaningful vocabulary to citizens and voters and, in the end, politicians, that this is a job creation opportunity, it is an opportunity to turn to really help our industry decarbonize while muscling up its competitiveness, we will fail. And Vladimir Putin knows that. That is actually why let's not forget, he is a KGB agent. And I say is because one is and one always remain. And he understands the European psychology. He understands how democracies work, that if voters are worried, are concerned about any hindrance to their security and obviously prosperity, they will always vote against any kind of risk taking. And that's why he said, with that cynical smile, oh, we no way have intention to invade Europe, but should Europe want to fight, we're ready. It's exactly the same. It's in line with the testing of the Poseidon missile, saying, it's been on the agenda for many years, but I think it came at the right time.
I must ask you one more question about that. Is Europe ready for war? Europe isn't managing to get an awful lot of agreement on how to cooperate on defence spending. The UK has not come to terms with it because it was asked to pay into the fund. An argument with France, others, but particularly with France. But even between France and Germany, still some disagreements about common investment. Is that making progress at all, do you think?
Well, we've seen Canada now will join, so it shows that it won't be just an EU vehicle for European players. So it is meant to be a EU vehicle open to friendly allies and nations, but it takes time. 27 states and having 27 states aligned, it's true that it's way more challenging than just having some regions in a federal country aligned. And this is obviously not in favor of strengthening our collective resilience. This being said, we've seen progress. Now we hear that the Germans are no longer so reluctant to seeing the French lead on jet fighters, and the French are more open to having the Germans lead on tanks, for instance. So we still need to come to terms with the fact that no single country will dominate every single industry. It is crucial.
Natalie, what do you think European leaders should do? Should they try and say to their populations, look, this war is coming to you, it's coming to your door? I mean, those countries that are closest to Russia have no need of persuading. I'm thinking of the Baltics and Poland. But what do you think Keir Starmer should say to British voters?
Well, first of all, I think the choice presented to European voters, British, continental, should not be between healthcare and security, your jobs, and war in Ukraine. I think the message should be recalibrated. It is about protecting security at home. You can't have jobs. Everything becomes secondary if there is a real risk. It's not about protecting Ukraine only. It's about protecting security in Europe. This is why Europeans are obviously worried about what comes out of various talks between Americans and Russians, because Russians want victory, Americans want the end to the war without necessarily thinking what kind of an end. And the nature of the peace deal will define whether there's going to be a sustainable peace in Europe and in Ukraine, or whether there will be seeds for a new conflict on in there. And I think this is where Europeans are preparing. They are not ready for the war right now. That was your question, but they are preparing for it slowly. And I think the message again here to the public should be that they're preparing for war not because they want to fight it, despite Putin's generous invitation, but they're preparing for war because they want to secure peace through deterrence.
Jaroslava, what does Ukraine do now? At this exact moment when we're talking, there is no deal. Not even a deal that is terrible for Ukraine as it looked as if we were heading to a couple of weeks ago. So Ukraine is going into this winter with a prospect of just having to keep fighting. Can it do that?
It's very important for Ukrainians to send the message out there that indeed exhaustion is something very real. The idea that Ukrainians are incredibly resilient, it's something that is objectively true. However, resilience is not an infinite resource. So they want to be able to say that we're humans and we're exhausted. However, we will fight for as long as it's needed, because this is a war of national survival. The survival of the nation and state as such is at stake. So this is the fundamental truth that both the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society at large believe still as we grind into the fourth year of the war. There's been this flurry of diplomatic activity over the past few weeks with this renewed momentum around different possible drafts of what a peace deal might look like. And what is important is that Ukraine and its European allies have been unambiguously stating what should be the red lines. And by red lines, essentially, is conditions that would make peace fundamentally non-durable. And this is something that Russia is trying to achieve. As Natalie was saying, yes, if the opportunity is there, Russia would like to end this war on its own terms. However, currently we haven't seen a strategic breakthrough. And so Ukraine is fundamentally bracing itself for fighting for much longer.
How much money does Ukraine need to get through the winter? Ukraine's been saying for some time to Europeans, look, we can make the weapons, give us the money.
Currently, the calculation is that Ukraine will need around 136 billion euros over the next 2 years. But over the past few years, as we've seen a number of delays from Ukraine's partner in arms provisions, Ukraine has also bolstered its own domestic arms production and trying to sort of achieve autonomy in that respect.
And it's done an amazing job on that. Wars are unfortunately very good for technological development, but Ukraine has outstripped a lot of Europe on that. Grégoire, let me come back to the question of where Europe is in this.
As shocking as what I'm about to say might sound to some of our listeners, for many European citizens, Russia is no threat. I know we don't want to hear that, but it is what many people in Europe think, because when you tell them, and I just have discussion with, very educated Germans, some of whom now are voting for the AfD, for instance, and they tell me, but look, you keep saying that Russians are a threat. I don't see any threat in Germany. I see a threat of, radical Islam. I don't see a threat of Russia. And the more time passes, now it will be 4 years in a few months, next March, the less clear it is in people's mind what the war is about. So it's clear who invades whom when it happens. 4 years later, people's memory seems to be fading away. And of course, the corruption scandal has not helped. So my point is, let's not take for granted the fact that everyone understands that Russia is a threat and is a security threat to Europe. And that's why I believe it's crucial that European leaders in the narrative do not just say we need to support Ukraine, whatever it takes. It is also about European security of some of our politicians. The CEO of Rheinmetall, the German defense industry, actually, there was a plot to assassinate him. So now he cannot leave a room without 5 bodyguards behind him. And I don't even need to remind everyone of the Skripal affair and Litvinenko here in London. So yes, Russia is a threat. Is it an enemy from a military standpoint? It isn't. It can be if there is a war, which we should all avoid by putting all the level of deterrence we need. And that also means being serious when we talk about, for instance, military service. I understand that, seizing the frozen asset is something, but let's face it, the World Bank estimates the cost of annual reconstruction in Ukraine to roughly $150 billion. That's actually the level of Russian frozen assets in Europe. So fine, we can seize it. You will fund reconstruction for a year. I think it's much political ado about nothing. What really matters is how credible European deterrence is, and I think we are not taking it seriously.
Natalie, let me come to you at the end. You've heard what Grégoire said about what some Germans have said to him, and I've indeed heard the same in Berlin, having spent part of the weekend going around museums of the Cold War and of the DDR, East Germany. And so, to some people, it is very fresh in their minds what that represented. You represented Georgia in Brussels for 8 years. What would you say to Europeans now?
When I was in Georgia, one of the hardest tasks for me was to convince European colleagues and counterparts that Russia was a threat not only to Georgia and Ukraine, but also to them indirectly at that time. Despite 2008, which was the first time Russia attacked Georgia, and then 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the sort of limited war that they started in eastern Ukraine. It took full-scale invasion of Ukraine for this message to come through. And there is a growing consensus about the extent of Russian threat to Europe among the elites. Not all of them, there are differences, and obviously there will always be differences. If you look at the EU, the South will not feel the same kind of threat as the Baltics will, and I think that's normal. But at the level of elites, there is an understanding that this is a dangerous situation for Europe. The danger is compounded by the fact that there is a real rift in the transatlantic partnership.
I was going to bring us right back to this question of America, where we started.
Yes, America is fundamental here because Europe, we know, outsourced its security to the United States. It trusted the United States. And the NATO was the major deterrence. Russians don't fight NATO member states allies directly. They engage in hybrid, subversive, below-threshold activities, but they don't go conventional because they don't want peer-on-peer confrontation. This was an effective deterrence. The weaker that link is, and the weaker the U.S. security umbrella over Europe, the greater risk it is for Europe. And that rift has been deepened by this war. And we will have to see, it might even deepen further, depending how far Trump goes.
So what do you think right now, this week, European leaders should say to the US as it looks at the rebuff of its attempted deal with Putin?
It's very difficult at the moment for me to see what they have to say in a way that could convince Trump. I think European leaders have no other option but to stand behind Ukraine and to present a joint diplomatic front. Because as I said, these talks, it's a very difficult, complex diplomatic effort. It is a process and it is a content. So Europeans have to manage both and help Zelensky and Ukrainians get the best out of it. The process is difficult, and I think now Putin is doing better because Putin keeps Trump engaged. But Europeans have to be backing Ukraine here because they actually ultimately have the same interest. The interest is to secure Ukraine and to make Ukraine, the good deal for Europe would be the kind of a deal that allows Ukraine to be a net contributor to the European security. And this is exactly what Putin doesn't want to. So this is the fight, what it's about.
Absolutely. That is what it's about. And so for Europe, I think it comes back to money and showing the US that it is prepared to do considerable things independently. On that, I think the US has won the argument that Europe needs to step up. We are going to have to stop there, but we will obviously keep following this as it develops. And please do look at the Chatham House website where our terrific teams, plural, who are very much engaged in this, are working on it as the very difficult situation evolves. With that, I am going to stop. So a warm, warm thanks to my guests, Grégoire Roos, Natalie Sabanadze, Jaroslava Barbieri. And please do join us next week. Even though we are heading towards Christmas, things are not remotely getting quiet, and we have a lot to talk about. See you next week.